Hi, folks. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Carla, and my last name is Diana, which sounds like a first name, but it is my last name. Um, and I'm here to talk about getting interaction off the screen and into the real world, or really how to approach designing products that embrace both the physical and the digital. So this has been really the focus of my career. I studied mechanical engineering for my undergraduate and then worked as an engineer and a product testing evaluation person, and then went and pursued a master's degree in design. And really, while I was doing that, it was at the dot-com era, and there was so much excitement, and I had been a teenager who had done a lot of coding, but what really made a light bulb go off on above my head was that combining the physical and the digital was where the most exciting work was going to be for me. And so I've always focused my career there. I worked for a firm called Frog Design. I worked for a firm called Smart Design for many years. This is one of the kinds of products that I worked on at Smart Design. They were a startup at the time called Nito Robotics, and now are a fully fledged and really successful company. And after doing a lot of work with consumer electronics at firms like Smart and Frog, and also on my own as a freelancer, I wound up collaborating with roboticists. So I should take a step back and say I've also always kept one foot in academia and one foot in industry, because I found that being in touch with academia gave me a glimpse of what was to come in the future of product design. I would go to academic conferences, I would have colleagues that were working in design and technology, and it would always just give you this kind of crystal ball. So I really encourage folks to pay attention to what's happening in the worlds of design technology programs like one that I'm going to talk about, and also programs like HCI, Human-Computer Interaction, at schools all over the country. So the next few slides are a series of projects that I worked on in collaboration with a professor who I met while I was teaching as a visiting assistant professor at Georgia Tech. And her name was Dr. Andrea Tomaz, and she had come out of MIT Media Lab focusing on a field of robotics that is a subset that is called social robotics, that is completely focused on studying how we might interact with machines in a completely natural way, bringing to the table no background in coding or secret button presses or cryptic ways of operating a computer. Instead, just what you know as a social human being, gesturing the way I am now, making eye contact, speaking, etc. So these next few projects were a few of the things that Dr. Tomaz was working on, and she brought me on. Well, actually, I'll get into those a little more, but as just an introduction to my own practice, in addition to my design work, I've always found the work really exciting. So I've always tried to find venues to share that. So I've written essays in the past and enjoy doing projects. So My Robot Gets Me, which I'll talk about in depth in this talk, is my latest book, which really tells the story of discovering social robotics and how social robotics can apply to everyday product design. But prior to this, I wrote a children's book about the future of 3D printing, where I took advantage of having illustrations and photographs. So everything that's featured in the book can be downloaded and 3D printed. And it allowed me to have an experiment. This was in 2014 when desktop 3D printers for the home were just starting to become popular. So it allowed me, I've always tried to find ways that I can get my hands on an experiment where I can just my own firsthand feel what it feels like. So another piece that I did that really leans into this idea of robotics and product design was an article that I did for the New York Times, an op-ed that was called Talking Walking Objects, and then a collaboration with an illustrator, Katie Turner, where I made a number of scenarios of what products might be, and they get more and more fantastical. So there's an alarm clock that wakes you up in the morning. There's a smart mirror that tells you your stats. There's a bicycle that has handlebars that tell you the directions through haptic feedback. There's a memory pen, there's a door that greets you, and then finally there's a sous chef. And all of these things were sort of fanciful but inspired by, again, things that I saw happening in design and academia. And then all of these somehow wound up becoming things that were startups at some point. There's been a version of this kind of alarm clock, lots of smart mirrors, lots of haptic. And even though, the last one I thought, that's ridiculous, but I do see products coming out that way. And then for me, it's also really important to take a lot of time to reflect on the ethical implications of everything that we do in technology and how it affects society. So I did get asked to do a piece for Popular Science in, I think, 2016 around autonomous vehicles, around the Tesla Autopilot in specific. And it allowed me to share some thoughts about the importance of design and how important it is for the machine to let you know what expectations to have of what I call the robot brain, and to not, as a designer, fall into science fiction images that people might have as a preconceived notion, but really let them know, what does that vehicle see? How is it processing that information in as quick a split-second way as possible? Not an easy task. And then what I've been doing in the last 5 years, in addition to my consulting work with social robotics projects, is I was asked to go to my alma mater, which is the Cranbrook Academy of Art, a very small but well-known in art design and architecture school in suburban Detroit. And they wanted to they have a history in crafts and design. Certainly, they're very well known. The Eameses had come from there, Harry Bertoya, many, many artists. And it's the first new program in 47 years that is bringing technology to the fore. And we're calling it 4D design. And I graduated my third cohort this past May. And so that's been a real passion project for me, which I'll talk about at the end. So the book, My Robot Gets Me, it's really focused on these stories. I tell a little bit about my pedagogy with 4D design, but I really talk about the story of having worked on robots. And even though those seem like these fantastical academic projects, how they really can relate to product design for anyone who's approaching everyday products. And so this project was the first one that I worked on with Dr. Tamaz, and it was a project called Simon. It had many, many degrees of freedom. There were microphones inside the head. There were cameras in the eyes. These ears could move and be expressive in the way that a pet's ears can. And it was really pushing those boundaries of how can we communicate with a machine through human means, and how can we have the machine express back to us what it's thinking, what it's feeling, and in a language that we understand. So these were some of Simon's diverse ways of saying, I don't know, or I don't understand. So the project was also a big exercise in teaching a machine how to learn. So there are videos online of this robot not understanding a color, and then it puts the color up to its eyes. It gathers information of what the pixels in the camera are for what it's seeing, and then you say, well, it goes in the green bin, like it's a green object, and then it maps that word green to the pixels that it sees in its camera. So that's really was a lot of what was going on with Simon, and it was designed from the ground up with also an amazing team. Mechanical engineer Jonathan Holmes, Dr. Tamaz, and her entire team of PhD students who were working on the artificial intelligence part of the project. And then some other projects were designed in different ways. Like this one, Polly was much less humanoid, and it was really cameras. We had one arm that kind of came from the middle of it. It was a really interesting, cool challenge as a designer, but it helped me to really cement some of the principles that I felt were important, like showing through the design what the robot's capabilities are, what's its fields of vision, does it hear or not, how is it expressing itself, so it still had an expressive head. And this robot was used at UT Austin, so in a lab called the Socially Intelligent Machines Lab for many, many different applications to study what might it be like in a cafe, what might it be like for someone with disabilities in a kitchen, what might it be like at a party, what might it be like in a hospital. And the hospital application wound up really striking a chord with the nurses and other people who were medical professionals. And Dr. Tamaz wound up getting approached with her collaborator Vivian Chu to create a startup called Diligent Robotics. And the focus of Diligent is to address nurse burnout with this AI-powered robot that basically is able to, first of all, the turnover rate for nurses is around 20%. Clinical staff reported spending an average of 30% of their time on non-care activities, and they were clocking 8 to 10 miles a day. So this is really one of the core features of the robot. So that if you can imagine a nurse wanting to help a patient with a blanket and having to run up and down the hallways just to come back with that blanket, now can send this assistant off to get the blanket. It can send it off to the pharmacy to get the meds and bring them back and go in the elevator. And so it's been a really, really juicy and super interesting design challenge for myself as a designer to think about how to interact with what is basically this cabinet on wheels. So this is an image, you see that, of what Moxie looks like today. So we're calling the robot Moxie, and it's continually being improved as we get feedback from customers, but it has been rolled out in several hospitals at this point, and this is really what it looks like. So there's a robotic arm, and our latest version actually has a screen in the chest, so this needs to be updated a little bit. But you can see the cabinet here, you can badge in, you can open it, you can put what's needed in there. And it's got this expressive head, it's got RGB depth cameras, if you imagine something like the Kinect that can sense a person's gesture, it can understand when there are obstacles in the way, it can navigate hallways, it's got LED eye expressions, so it's not so exaggerated as that first robot that I showed you, but it's still able to give feedback and say, I didn't understand, or I don't know, or confirm things. And so here are some of the design principles that we are focused on in developing some of the more important features. So feedback is very important. So there's voice response, the robot will actually talk. There is a facial expression, there's a lot of head and arm gestures. So some of the things that we learned from those deep studies in academia are things like shared gaze, so that if there are many people but one person's giving the robot instructions, that person knows that the robot is looking at them. There's also shared focus, so if there's a spill and you say, Moxie, we need to avoid that spill, you can point to it and Moxie can let you know. So we have all of these subtleties that we do socially every time we speak to someone else that we may not even realize. And so a lot of the focus of the work has been around taking advantage of that. So here's some images of the robot in action. It meets, it does these meets. We've got many projects coming up too, like sound, like advanced sound.
All right, thank you. That's it? All right, thanks.
So there's a pharmacist being trained. And these were locally at the hospital near where I am in Michigan, so that's been exciting to have a Moxie near us. It's a couple, actually. So there it is navigating the hallways. So, the robot knows the difference between saying excuse me if it's really too close to someone or just sort of greeting someone. And here's someone using the queue so setting up a delivery. So this is a kiosk that's on a desk. So there's an entire ecosystem of products that include kiosks at the desk and eventually mobile applications as well as the physical robot. And what was really amazing to me about being able to visit it and track it in person, because of course I've been in many, many meetings and from the ground up at the very start when we were just having cardboard mock-ups, but to actually see the robot with nurses who didn't know who I was amazing, because it also just highlighted the importance of the nuances of design, because we designed it to be a helper and assistant, and part of the team was part of our MO, and I really heard the nurses' excitement, or maybe excitement isn't the right word, but a sense of comfort from having this assistant on their team. And they would say, oh, here's Moxie. Do you have anything for Moxie? I'm going to show you how Moxie works. And it's been pretty amazing to see how well it's been received. And from a startup point of view, it's also been amazing to be with the company from the ground up, from those very first cardboard mock-ups to this moment now. This is actually a couple of years ago, but this is an article. This is on their blog post, and it's talking about 10,000 tasks that the robots have done as a milestone. And this is a quote from Andrea: "When Diligent was just two ambitious founders with seed funding, working out of our investor's office and testing a robot arm on a tabletop in January of 2018, and to see where they are now." And they've gotten tons of press. So I pulled out just a quick quote. Diligent Robotics, founded by two women, raised over $30 million in April. The funding will be used to deal with supply chain issues and hire more employees to deploy Moxie, a collaborative robot. Tiger Global and the company's existing investors, True Ventures, DNX, Ubiquity, E14, Next Coast, Boom, Ganger also participated, along with a new investor. So this will help the company scale. So it's a particularly exciting moment. I've actually moved from head of design to being design advisor as they've scaled up and now have a team that includes designers that I work alongside as needed. Oh, and this is a picture of someone with the robot. Okay, you missed it. You missed it. So Moxie is an example of what I would call extreme social intelligence for a product. And my interest in robotics has never been to replicate humans. It happened to be that I found this collaborator with this deep interest and research in social robotics that was pushing those limits and pushing, like, what if it had eyes? What if it had eyes, ears, eyelids, and eyebrows? And I mean, well, we've pushed it so far. But my interest has really been looking at what we can learn from that research with real people and robots, and then distilling it into abstractions that are just the only gestures. Like, can we have the most simple, elegant gestures that are still expressive in our everyday products? So that's really what the My Robot Gets Me book is about. And it's written at this moment of time where, we're now all abuzz about AI. And where that comes into play here is that in my decade and a half or more of working as a product designer, the things that I worked on were typically canned messages. We would have things, if you had a microwave, it would know to beep 3 times to let you know popcorn was done, or there was just an already scripted set of responses. And to what we're going to see emerging now, where the product itself is an entity that can change and learn and adapt to the people that are using it, and all of the questions and pitfalls that come with that. But it was it was again a pivotal moment in time that I felt like deserved a deep project to investigate what this would be like. So now you might have an oven that learns that you do dinner parties all the time and alert you and coach you around how you're cooking based on some, deep learning. So, but how this manifests in a physical thing, it really came from this study of robotics. And a lot of robotics was inspired by animation. And so when I talk about this abstraction, the three modalities that I'm looking at are sound, light, and movement. And so I did study the way that animators approach making things expressive. And there is this traditional exercise they do, that's the flour sack exercise. How can you make this flour sack look different ways? And then in terms of the core of the book really follows a framework that is all of the things to keep in mind, because what's really challenging is that there are physical things, there's animation, there's code, there's light, sound, and motion, and then there's the actual physical form. So this framework is a way for teams to constantly remind themselves to check along that spectrum along the way. So it's broken down, most of the structure of the book is broken down into these different rings, which are it's kind of like an onion that builds on itself, that starts in the core with presence. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. So presence is the physical form. And that seems obvious, but it's also obvious to make things disappear. Like I'm sitting in this room that's quite elegant, and I could see it might make sense to have our speakers, our lights, everything could start to disappear within the walls. And what I advocate for is thinking about moments when it might be really important to have a physical presence. When you go into an airport and there's a kiosk there and you're late and you're stressed, and like having some physical presence where you feel like, oh good, there's help for me there, is really important. So I included some examples. There are examples in the book. There's a story, whoop, I went the wrong way. There is a story that where I talk about, I also included several interviews. So I interviewed Rocky Jacob, who had worked on the Nest outdoor security camera, and it was just a really interesting nuance where he talked about how there's usually a shield over a camera, and it was making it look like, and I shouldn't call it security camera because it's an outdoor camera, and it made it look like a little police hat, where he insisted on working with the engineers to give it a friendly look so it wasn't being perceived as or used just as a security camera, but as a camera for all other, like seeing where your friends are approaching, knowing when your package is there, et cetera, et cetera. And then, from my own practice, this is a project that I had worked on as a consultant from the ground up again, from the cardboard mock-ups, when I was approached by Ted Booth, who was working with a professional drummer whose name is Conrad Meissner, and he explained his experience of metronomes. And he said, I'm a professional drummer, I'm out there on the stage, the drummer sets the beat for the whole band. I nod my head, my bandmates look at me, and the way that I set the tempo is with a metronome, and every single metronome on the market is a little fussy rectangle where I have to get out of my mode of performing and do this thing over here on the side. Can you help me? And so we worked with Conrad and developed this metronome that's called the click brick, where it's entirely operated by drumsticks. So it has an adapter to screw right onto the drum kit, and you strike it once to get it started, you strike it to stop it, you can use your drumsticks to adjust. And then so that was a rendering, but here's the actual prototype that he's been taking on the road, and it's actually now in production. So and the newest version of it, he can strike it so that it actually has the tempo that he's tapping out on the device. But he can now do this while he's performing, and he can hear feedback from the metronome, and he can just glance over and see the beats per minute, etc. Expression is probably my favorite aspect of the concentric circles, and this is how an object lets us know what messages it has for us. Like, I'm running out of batteries, or I'm a robot vacuum and I'm stuck underneath the couch, or this is a toy that's from Wonder Workshop that kids can program. My son and I have this, and we work with it a lot. It has just one eye, but you can adjust different facets to the lights, and you can make it seem like it's angry or anxious or happy or curious. And the example I pulled out from my practice was the Nito Robotics project that I worked on when I was at Smart Design. And one of the things that we really, really focused on was sound. And I worked with a composer whose name is Scooby Leposki, and we developed an entire language. So I wrote out a script that were some of those things, like I'm waking up, or I'm turned on, or I'm shutting down, or I'm stuck. And we talked about what the emotion was in terms of if you looked at that robot as a character, even though it's just a almost rectangle on the floor. But is it in a state of distress? Does it need to alert you? How much help does it need? How can you avoid it being annoying? So these were some of the sounds. Oh, and this is also just another prototype. I'm a big believer in just lots of prototyping. So the first one is when it's starting up cleaning, and it's like, I'm off to work. And then this particular robot uses something that's kind of an equivalent of LiDAR scanning. So I was working with the engineers. I said, oh, can it recognize if something has changed, like someone has moved in front of it? And he said, yeah, I think we can do kind of a greeting. So we developed this, oh, hello. And then there are these really short sounds for the alerts. So this is trapped, or when it's full. And then this is a wake up and a goodbye, like going to sleep. So these, and we came up with a custom typeface also for the robot. Like all of these nuances that just seem like they might be traditional are not. We're pioneers. If you're working in this world where the physical and the digital combined, we don't have a rich history, so we have to be developing it. The next ring is interaction. So where that comes from is, yes, you can have this object that expresses itself, but then the real conversation happens when it's sensing what you need or sensing the environment around it in order to respond and change its response. So this is a schematic of a product that's called EliQ, that is a personal assistant for folks with cognitive disabilities that helps them navigate a screen-based interface with kind of a robotic head. This is developed by Fuse Project, and this really is a super interesting abstraction where it's kind of a lampshade head that just kind of nods, and it'll say you have an appointment, or it's time for you to exercise, it's time for you to take your meds, or you have a call, do you want to take it, that kind of thing. And then for my own practice, so I really just get excited about, again, trying things out. So when it comes to interaction, I like to try and experiment with any kind of sensor that I get in my hands. Like, I'm an avid sailor, so right now I have this wind sensor that I'm playing with. So in 2014, I was doing a residency and collaborating with a woman named Emily Baltz, who is the designer for the senses. At the time, she was describing her practice as food design. And we collaborated with a composer named Aaron Dyer, and we created what we call the Lickestra. So I was interested in capacitive sensing, or a lot of what like these screens that we use capacitive sensing, so that they sense your body. And we wanted to create something that was entirely operated by your tongues. So this is the Lickestra. So we had them in boxes where they couldn't use their hands, and we had It's an interface. We we did several variations of it. We did a variation of it where we got a donation from Big Gay Ice Cream Company in an old grocery store turned gallery space in downtown Manhattan. And the way that I designed the tech to work, you could take any cup that was a thin-walled cup and put it in there because there was kind of a ring around it. So we had everyone with their ice cream, and we could just ask for volunteers. So it was a lot of fun. It's perhaps my most frivolous project, but it's also the project that has gotten me and Emily, who is also a very accomplished designer working at Gensler right now, more attention than anything else we've done. Like, we got called by Wired. They wanted us to bring our orchestra on America's Got Talent, and we didn't take it that far. But so the next part of the ring after interaction is context. So you can have this interaction, but then the decision for how the object will interact really depends on context. And context is one of the most sophisticated parts of every aspect of robotics, knowing what is the temperature, what's the time, what's the state of mind of the person using it, what's happening on the calendar at that particular moment in time. The example that I pull out that some of my colleagues at a group called Tomorrow Lab in New York worked on is a Hammerhead bicycle navigator. So this is a device that connects with your phone, but it communicates entirely through lights. There's no screen, and it's completely water resistant, and it mounts to the handlebars of your bike. And it's really, I feel like, a great example of understanding presence, the physical form, how it's expressing itself, as well as the fact that, like, at that moment, you don't need the whole map and the whole screen. You just need the directions. And then from my practice, because I also teach, I'm always thinking about principles of interaction design. And one of the things that I was thinking about, again, was context, was the fact that we can have an entire internet connected. A lot of my practice has been focused on Internet of Things, and playing with these microcontrollers that can be connected to the internet. So you could have any piece of information on there, but how about we just have the smallest piece of information we need for that particular moment? So this is a coat rack that looks completely wooden. So it's hollowed out, and then it has LEDs that will shine through it. So when you're not near it, it just looks like a wooden panel. And then when you approach it, it wakes up, and it will give you the high temperature, the low temperature, and any significant conditions like rain or snow that are happening during the day. And so you just have a split-second decision where you're there, you approach the coat rack, you go, oh, I better bring my umbrella. And that's really the gist of the entire project. It doesn't need your Facebook feedback or stock quotes or any of that. And then following that, and what I talked about a little bit with the Diligent product, is ecosystems. So what gets really extra challenging is if you have all these things that are sounding and lighting and motioning, and then they're all in the room, and they've all got their presence, and they're competing. There's an ecosystem. So a large part of, I think, contemporary product design is thinking about ecosystems. How are those devices relating to one another? And this example that I have here are the WeThings suite of products, where they have a wearable, they have a scale, then those things can all combine and give you fitness feedback. The example, this is from the New York Times lab. It's not from my practice, but I love this example as interaction intelligence. So they created a listening table. So this is a table where people can have a meeting. The meeting will be recorded, and they can tap the table when they want to make note of a particular part of the conversation. They have easily accessible switches underneath, so they can shut those when they don't want part of the conversation, again, in a tangible way that takes advantage of presence. And it is just understanding the context of the meeting, as well as the ecosystem of sending this information then to their other devices, and thinking about the speaker as well as the microphones, etc. And then, finally, the last chapter was really challenging one because I finished this book when the pandemic had just hit. And I was thinking, basically locked in a room writing this, forcing myself to write this book all by myself. And I had started seeing just lots of press about robots, and part of it felt like, oh, okay, well, our time has come. Like, here are all these robots, but it also just felt really hollow because I felt like I was interested in this to help people. Like the Diligent story, genuinely, when I see those nurses, I feel like they are getting some relief. But there was all this news about like delivery robots and not having to leave your house and of course I understand the practicality of that, but that pandemic moment seemed like a moment in time. So I really felt like it's just important, again, to reflect on, do we really need these robots? If they're keeping us from genuine human interaction, then that's not a good thing. But I was thinking about that, so that's what the last chapter is about. And then, finally, the last thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit was the 4D design department at Cranbrook. So 5 years ago, I was approached. I was back in New York City, my hometown, and then I was approached to start this new program that was being called 4D Design and be its founder and its founding head of the program. And what was exciting about this was, first of all, there were several interaction design programs, and many of them focused on software and apps, which is a deep practice that is extremely important. But those already existed, and so. And I felt like we were at a moment in time, and it's been very challenging as a designer to look for those opportunities because most of the opportunities are in software. Most of the more lucrative opportunities are there, but I just always had this passion for seeing how the physical world combines with it. And even if it's not necessarily a physical manifestation of the product, it's this my robot gets me mentality of thinking about what's the context? What are the things in the room? Like, even if it is an app, like how am I holding that rectangle? Are my palms sweaty? Am I nervous? Are there 2,700 other rectangles in the room at the same time or not? And where is my face position? How am I holding it? All of those things. So 4D design has really been this focus of thinking about interaction in the physical world and every aspect. So I really push my students when they have projects to think about, okay, well, you've designed this thing. How does it relate to the other things in the room? How does it relate to the context of the person who's using it, their state of mind, what's happening in their lives, in their calendar, and what they're thinking about? And this opportunity came to join this amazing institution that has a contemporary art museum as well as an institute of science that is a natural history museum that is on our campus. And we're a K through 12 campus, so we have 300 acres that house the museums as well as the K through 12, as well as this very, very small art school that has 130 or 145 students. 11 programs, and now 4D design is one of them. And so the students who are in the program, their craft is, well, the way I describe it is the craft is code, form, again, understanding the physical world, and electronics. So everybody solders, everybody uses microcontrollers, at least in the simplest way, and everybody codes at least a little bit, at least knowing how to learn how to learn. How can you know what you need to do and know where to find open source tools or other tutorials where you can teach yourself to learn? And the way that a lot of this manifests is through, again, microcontrollers, lighting projects, 3D printing, projection mapping, as well as everyone needs to at least have some familiarity with a tool like Figma to be able to mock up an interface. And so that was one of our students. Again, form, code, and electronics manifests in light, sound, and movement. And so some of the aspects of the program are experimental electronics. So again, I have a really just deep interest and passion around that expression ring of the framework. How do objects communicate? How can we abstract that? So these are some projects. This one is called Exoskeleton by a student named Chenzo. Ryan Janina had created this lamp, each of the students does a project that is shown in our final degree show at the Contemporary Art Museum. And so this is a lamp that will respond to the energy in the room based on the sound, like of conversation, so based on volume. These next few projects are by Michael Candy, who has had a fascination with creating very industrial robots that have a soul, let's say, or have some way of having personality. So this is a reel of some of his projects that he was already working on before joining 4D, and then he actually was in our very first class and then went back to Australia. He had moved to Michigan from Australia and then came back just this past year. So he was part of this most recent graduating class. So he's done several projects. This is a project that he did that's called Little Sunfish. And he had seen a video of the cleanup after the Fukushima disaster. And there was a little robot called the Sunfish. And he recreated it and recreated a set that simulated the reactor, and then made this narrative where this robot is a little character. So you'll see it in this video, it kind of blinks. And in his video narrative, it escapes and it goes out into the water and contaminates the water, and it kind of goes on. But there's his little robot. So he kind of goes on and on. He's shown this work at several, at a biennial in Australia, as well as the Museum of New Art in Australia, and he's continuing to work. So several of the students, our program really is on a spectrum from art to design, and several of the students, like Michael, is very interested in using design as a medium for art. And so I really, in the program, I try to encourage what the particular student's trajectory is and work with them as a mentor to help them get there. So some of the projects are more about sculpture. This one as well is a bit of a timepiece. So it will actually spin 1 second at a time and spin around the room. So then virtuality and digital presence, the impact of life online, is also some of the things that the students explore. This is was a project that a student named Vikram Kaladindi was hoping to launch as an NFT, and he called it a pound of flesh. And so one of the things that we were discussing was NFTs, creating value, how value comes from scarcity, and his proposal, because he was interested in losing 20 pounds, was that he would make an edition of 20 of this NFT, distribute only 20, and that for every one he would have a contract where he had to lose a pound and stick to that. It was a legally binding contract, and he hasn't launched it yet. But Jerry Lee did a project in 2021 for his degree show where he was looking at emoticons and just this way that we use graphics to express emotion, and could he collect the emotion of everyone who came through that museum show and have this kind of conglomerated emotional expression of reading the room. So there he is working on that. Another project by Vikram is a project that he was taking dialogue from gamers, and then this kind of invisible hand was scrolling them onto this big scroll. So he created kind of a religious situation in a room with glowing lights with this just autonomous scribe that was writing out all of those conversations, and it was kind of mesmerizing to watch. Social commentary is something we're always interested in. Meryl Norlander was spending her time focused on the idea of gender fluidity. So and also I launched this program and then had these students come from all over the world, and then had to have them disperse for the pandemic, because our first year was 2019. So they came in September, moved into their studios that were being renovated. They couldn't even move in till November, and then in March they left. And then several of them, Meryl among them, came back for the following fall. We were in person during the pandemic. We just had to learn ways to work where we weren't in a classroom together. So they would do projects, put them in a room, we would review them, and then we would meet virtually, all the things. I'm sure you were all familiar with the things that we did, but I really encourage students to take advantage of the outdoor space. So Meryl did this project about gender fluidity in a Greek theater that we have that's outdoors on our campus. And so she had filmed herself in the pool and then projected that. These are all rocks. So she gave this illusion of it being a swimming pool. And then she had Brian Kovach, who was singing an aria from Carmen, and there was also projected imagery all around him. Michael Candy, another project of his, is called the Selfless Driving Car. So this is a prototype for what he hopes to make a larger project. And this is an RC car that is entirely controlled by the audience. So the audience has an interface that he designed and distributed, and then everyone in the audience makes the car go left or right. And then the car will take the average of those responses. And so he launched it as this RC, that's Michael right there, but his plan has been to do it as a full-size car that he is inside. So I was introducing him to gallerists and trying to figure out venues. We didn't make it happen during his time at Cranbrook, but I believe that we may see it soon. Materiality. So again, Meryl was working on wearable electronics. This is a glowing suit. These are soft robotics experiments. You can use pneumatics inside of a silicon molded shape in order to make that shape become a gripper or change form in many ways. So she's been doing these experiments. She's now running a prototyping lab at Wayne State University and teaching some classes there. Chen Zhuo was working on ferrofluid. So this is actually an image from, he had kind of a picture frame. Inside the picture frame was this ferrofluid that looked very painterly, like you were looking at ink splots, but it was really ferrofluid that would be continuously changing, and he used that for his degree show. Cody Norman was, and we have a thing called an elective, which is kind of like someone who does a minor, because he was in the 3D department when I launched the program, but joined us part of the way, and he's been working with industrial robots to teach them new kinds of interfaces that are appropriate for artists. So how can you have these expressive interfaces? And he's made a practice out of creating housewares that are using this industrial arm. He's got more and more of them. He just had a gallery show. And then what's been exciting now is I have alums. So, there are a handful of them, but they're dispersed. And one of them is leading the prototyping lab at New Lab, which is a facility. There's one in New York, and now they just opened one in Detroit that is in the old train station called Michigan Central. And it is a facility to house startups. And so I have an alum who's running the prototyping lab, another person who was a departmental assistant of mine who's also working there. They're having an exhibition on Tuesday, and I'm kind of psyched to see where it all goes. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. This is my personal email, but you can also follow the 4D department on Instagram at Cranbrook4D. And we have time. I'm happy to chat. I'm happy to chat informally or more formally. But thank you all for coming. I know it's the end of the day, so I appreciate you being here. And the book is available at your local bookstore. Although the last one was purchased yesterday. The last one at Barnes & Noble around the corner, right? In Glendale. Oh, yeah, we got a question.
Yeah, so with all the time spent trying to put humanoid aspects into these robots and kind of anthropomorphize them and give them souls, as you kind of mentioned.
Yeah.
What should we our take away from seeing like all this robot violence from these like delivery? Yeah, everybody's familiar with these people just like spray painting them or knocking them over or doing these kind of untoward things to these robots. Like, what should we make of that if we're spending time trying to humanize these robots, and some of us in society are, kind of degrading them or acting violently towards them?
Oh, yeah, there's tons of that. So I used to co-host a podcast. It's called the RoboPsych podcast. Unfortunately, we're sunsetting it. We did 100 episodes, and we're like kind of done. But it's, first of all, how fascinating, like what a statement about the power of design. You're welcome. And I mean, there's something, like, there's emotion that's being evoked there clearly, right? I do think those are edge cases. I think there are a lot of people who are using robotic products and are finding comfort in them, or finding assistance in them, or are finding wonder in them. I think that there is also a lot of angst. I mean, we have a rich history of science fiction that paints a thing that we see as a robot as something nefarious, right? So I do think that we have that to consider, and then, I mean, there's also, unfortunately, the human nature of anonymity, of what we, when we see the same behavior when people go online and they are saying things to what are actually other humans that they would never say face to face, right? So, I don't see that as a widespread thing, but it's a testament to human nature. It's a testament to design. It's really fascinating. Yeah, that's Carl.
I'm curious about the design of the Moxie robot. When I'm thinking about that space, I'd like to see something like R2D2 or something, but it ended up being very humanoid, and so I'm UX, so I have very, very strong user bias. So I'm curious, was that more exploring what was possible in this space, or were you engaging with what nurses wanted to see or what patients wanted to see? I'm just curious where that design.
Yeah, I mean, so largely it came from a decade of research from my collaborator who was working at Georgia Tech and UT Austin in these socially intelligent machines labs. And because the biggest value add of Diligent Robotics is social robotics. Like, that's really what the company, that's their forte, right? So they knew, and we had a full spectrum of design solutions looking at many different form factors. And from the research that had been done prior to that, which again was not deep in hospitals, even though we did some research in hospitals, it pointed to taking advantage of what we knew about social robotics, what we knew about shared gaze, what we knew about a head that can gesture and confirm something or deny something, or show you where an object of interest is. And so I think that's really the heritage of the company, although we are certainly interested in exploring other form factors now that we have this rich body of feedback from the robots that are on the field. Yeah, it's a great question. Yes?
So, first, I think Moxie is a great idea. My mom was an ICU nurse, and she would have loved that.
Mm-hmm.
And my son is a 10th grader at a local science and technical school, and he's in the robotics club. And
cool.
Yeah, and I'm gonna share with him everything.
Oh, good.
He said, but I don't understand sometimes why they focus a lot on robotic competitions.
Mm.
And I've only seen the ones where they're lifting and moving things. So Is there venues for this, like where they can get more practice? I mean, are there?
Are there venues, you mean for kids and learning? Yeah. You know, that's really interesting. I think that because what you're talking about maybe comes from the engineering side of it, right, and not necessarily the design and social side of it, where there's a kind of a canon of engineering tasks that need to happen, like the lifting of the object, the putting of an object into another, and certainly also battle bots and that history that's very provocative and fun for people. But I wonder if was your son doing first? Like, because there's a program that was set up by Lego and it stands for something which I'm going to butcher, but I wonder as my son gets older, I've sort of thought, it'd be interesting to work with kids, and so maybe it just has to do with having more creativity in those benchmarks and bringing them to those educational programs, because one of the most challenging things we had this year with Moxie, so all the pictures I showed have Moxie with a gripper, but we actually wound up finding, because those were some of the original case studies where it was going to go in a closet and assemble these kits and do all this manipulation of stuff, and what we wound up finding was that what was more valuable was the robot being able to go to the further reaches of the hospital and be able to navigate elevators and push buttons. So we've actually been replacing the gripper with this. It seems like it was so challenging to get this finger. Like I had to design this finger and thumb so that it could, meet the criteria of all the positioning and still not look super weird. So your question makes me wonder. I wonder if that were a benchmark, pushing an elevator button, would that then change what some of the projects were like? Yeah.
I'm just curious on your take. I think that's a great segue into what I was kind of trying to formulate a question around. I think the Cranbrook program sounds amazing, and I see an opportunity to combine that sort of technical skills with the design. And like upcoming creatives, I mean, Canva and all of these AI things are sort of taking away the space of traditional design and painting and stuff like that, and you stick stuff out real quickly, which can be a little heartening. But the sort of immersive and experiential design and installations are still alive and well. So I'm just curious to see that combination of that in the future.
Yeah, I am too. I was thinking about it when I was on the plane going over my slides, because I was looking at Michael's work and I was thinking, I could make 100 AI images of this robot with lights, with light tubes for legs, and I just felt like, and I haven't actually been in the room with one of those robots, but there's the fact that somebody can be in the room with it is just, it's a completely different thing. And we talk about AI a lot in the program, and I think what's going to be interesting is to see again where value shakes out. How do we, if you can create an image so easily, then we won't value that as much as something else, and where do we place value as human beings? It's pretty interesting. Yes.
Does the work with IoT devices gotten to the point where these devices are available for, like, where you could try different things with it? For example, 10 years ago, some friends of mine and I, we took a day to do some IoT, but we had software that would do very well in IoT. But before lunch, we had the software working on a Raspberry Pi. But then it was like, okay, now what? We can flash a light, we can ring a bell. There just wasn't much else. And I just wondered if that has advanced in 10 years.
Yeah, I think that's where the program comes in, though, and that's where creativity comes in. I think that's where having Oh, there's lots, and we haven't created it, but there's a company called Adafruit. Like there are lots of boards now that that are much more accessible in terms of just plug and play, and then having a dashboard. You know, I know Adafruit makes one of them. There's a company called Spark that I've used, or Particle. They're called Particle, and they have several different kinds of boards that also take into account managing battery life, and because that then is really, if you're talking about IoT, you're talking about things that people can take out in the world. It doesn't need to be plugged in. You know, no, it's come a long way. It's come a super long way. I think. You know, what's still challenging is like you lose the Wi-Fi connection or the Bluetooth connection, and like that stuff's still pretty like super gnarly. And then the battery runs out, and then, you know, I mean, I think power and connectivity are still really tenuous things that affect.
But the connectivity, you just have to store stuff locally that you're gonna need.
Yeah,
So you can kind of get
you can get around that. Right. Well, unless you're, you know, well, I mean, unless it's something that is doing solar and storing it, or, you know, something like that. But I think it's more just around understanding what is real need, and, you know, in terms of applications. And but I keep seeing more and more IoT products. We see a lot of it actually in industry, like in farming. Farming uses a lot of IoT, and it's super helpful and informative. Yeah. And then I think also sports, you know, like even like smart design. I mean, I think just there's a lot of wearable computing in terms of metrics and health metrics. But the company that I was working with, Smart Design, worked with Gatorade on something might seem on the surface frivolous. So it's a hydration bottle, but they're able to really work with extremely they were working with the soccer team in Brazil at you know, athletes that were like keeping track of hydration and having different formulations of hydration was apparently really affected their performance. And so I think there's a whole world ahead of us of that. But thank you. Yeah, I think this is the last question I'll take.
So now that you have a few years of alums and a few years of 40 program going, I'm curious, aside from the kind of like prototyping labs where you see those students going, 'cause I did my MFA at DU and I taught there for 2 years.
Oh, very cool.
Now I'm curious, like I look at industrial design or product design, and like you said, it's a lot of app-based things, and where is this kind of physical digital meeting?
Yeah. I think, well, first of all, I do think that there's growing opportunity. Like I do think, I see job ads from companies like Samsung and Apple and HP and Microsoft that now suddenly have this job description that I feel like I never would have seen before, you know, where there is real value in the person who can navigate both the physical and the digital and be the translator in between those things. I mean, we certainly see it in design consultancies, but you know, yeah, and things like Under Armour, I think, is a company that's been doing a lot of. So I think in the sports realm, certainly in the medical realm, I just don't think a lot of organizations realize the value yet because it isn't a discipline that has a history. But I think it's a good place for one to position oneself to be ahead of the game. But okay, well, thank you all again, and thanks again for coming.